Chapter 1. A Shadow at the Window. It was a gray and bone-chilling morning in November, the kind which clings to one's spirits like damp wool. A heavy fog lay upon London, a murky curtain that blunted both sight and sound, rendering even the gas lamps little more than phantom halos in the gloom. I had ventured out that morning for the simplest of errands, to fetch a tonic for a lingering head cold, but by the time I returned to our quarters at 221B Baker Street, my coat was sodden and my mood no less so. I burst through the front door and stomped the chill from my boots. Mrs. Hudson, bless her, gave me a nod from the stairwell before retreating with a tray of tea for a guest downstairs. I climbed the stairs slowly, breathing in the familiar scents of burnt toast, leather bindings, pipe smoke, and the curious chemical tang that so often hung in the air when Holmes was in one of his experimental moods. Upon entering the sitting room, I was greeted by the snap and crackle of the hearth recently stoked, no doubt, and the peculiar sight of my friend in his dressing gown, seated cross-legged upon the settee like a monk in contemplation. Holmes glanced up as I entered, his pale eyes twinkling with amusement beneath his tousled hair. "You have been out for 23 minutes and 40 seconds, he said calmly, not bothering to mark his place in the volume he held. "Have you taken to timing me now?" I said, peeling off my gloves with a huff. You could hardly have seen a clock through that infernal mist. I had no need. The scent of ether on your lapel still strong suggests you came directly from Brocklehurst's chemist, who tends to overuse it in cleaning his counters. From the pattern of mud on your right boot, I surmise you crossed the puddle near the northeast curb of Wimpole Street, just where the drain has backed up from last night's rain. From this and the pace of your typical stride, I deduced the duration of your journey. I chuckled, despite myself. At some point you must allow me to surprise you, Holmes. Your deductions are so swift and effortless that I feel quite outpaced even before I've removed my hat. "Then I have done my job well," he said, leaning back and steepling his fingers. "Surprise is the pleasure of the magician, Watson. But truth, the slow, grinding truth, is the pleasure of the detective." I had scarcely seated myself by the fire when an unexpected sound interrupted the quiet harmony of the morning. 3 sharp raps distinct, deliberate upon the sitting-room window-pane. Dot. Both Holmes and I turned our heads in unison. The knock had come from the outer side of the glass 2 floors above the street. "Curious," Holmes muttered, rising swiftly. "Unless the pigeons have learned to use their knuckles. That was no accident." He strode to the window and drew back the thick velvet curtain. I joined him, and we peered into the fog. Nothing but the leaden mist beyond. The narrow ledge beneath the window was empty and bore no sign of disturbance. "Impossible for someone to stand there," I murmured. "Quite," Holmes said, his brow furrowed. He examined the sash, the latch, even the dust upon the sill. Still locked, no signs of forced entry or scraping. Whoever knocked knew precisely which pane to strike and when. As we speculated, a sharp rap came from the door, and Mrs. Hudson entered bearing a silver tray with a folded telegram. "This just arrived, Mr. Holmes," she said, visibly unnerved. "The boy said it was urgent." Holmes took the telegram with a nod and scanned it quickly. "Urgent, consultation required. A matter of utmost delicacy. Please meet at the lodging. House opposite Baker Street. Knock twice at room 6. Midnight. Come alone." A friend of the TOUT, he read it twice. then passed it to me. I frowned as I took it. "Across the street?" I asked. "And at such an hour?" The message is vague, overly so. It reads more like the start of a penny dreadful than a proper request for consultation. Holmes gave a rare smile. "You forget, Watson, the theatrical nature of crime. A criminal rarely sends a polite letter and calls during office hours. They prefer shadow, suggestion, and suspense. But who lives in that house now?" I asked. "It's been vacant for weeks, ever since Mr. Cattermole moved out. You said the landlord was still seeking tenants." "Correct," Holmes replied, already at the mantel examining his pipe collection. "Which raises a most intriguing question. Who, then, has invited us?" That night, London seemed a city caught between breaths. The fog had not lifted. Indeed, it had deepened, muting the world into silence. Holmes prepared for the meeting in his usual manner, calmly, precisely, and with that singular focus he exhibited when the scent of a mystery had reached his nostrils. He donned a dark cloak, and Cap checked the fit of his revolver and turned to me. "I must go alone, as instructed," he said. "But I want you awake and watching. If anything untoward occurs across the street, you are to act without hesitation." "I dislike this," I admitted. "You're walking into an obvious trap." Holmes' smile was thin but resolute. And that, my dear Watson, is precisely why it must be walked into. If we refuse the bait, we learn nothing." He descended the stairs and vanished into the mist. From my perch at the sitting-room window, I watched his silhouette cross the street and disappear into the lodging house opposite. A single gas lamp flickered dimly nearby, painting shifting shadows along the facade. The next hour passed in utter stillness. The hands of the clock ticked like muffled footsteps. I stirred only once, pouring a measure of brandy to steady my nerves. Then it happened, a shriek, a high-pitched, terrible sound, half agony, half warning, echoed from within the lodging house. I was on my feet instantly, heart hammering. At that moment a second light bloomed briefly in an upstairs window. I saw a shadow flail, then collapse out of sight. I did not hesitate. Revolver in hand, I threw on my coat and bolted down the stairs. The fog was thick, swallowing my form as I crossed the street. The door to the house stood ajar, just as Holmes had predicted a good trap should. Inside, the foyer was dark and musty, the air carrying a tang of age and mildew. The wallpaper peeled like curling skin, and the floorboards groaned underfoot. I mounted the stairs 2 at a time, my heart pounding. Room 6. The door was slightly open. I nudged it with the barrel of my revolver. The room was lit by a single candle, its flame barely holding against the draft. There, lying sprawled across a crimson rug, was a man in a velvet smoking jacket, his face pale, his throat torn open in a grotesque, glistening gash. Blood pooled in thick puddles, staining the once elegant floorboards beneath him. I swallowed bile. My eyes lifted to the wall above the body, where words had been scrawled in large, ragged strokes of what I could only assume was blood. "Crimson Spectre has awakened." The candle flickered once, then guttered out. Section. Chapter 2. The Man Without a Past. Scene before me was one of such grim horror that I found myself momentarily frozen. My revolver trembled in my grasp, the fog of my breath visible in the cold stillness of the room. The candle, now extinguished, left only a faint glow from the corridor behind me to illuminate the ghastly tableau. The blood on the wall glistened weightly beneath the arch of the doorway. For a few seconds I could do little but stare at the crude. Message: the Crimson Spectre has awakened. I advanced slowly, my footsteps muffled by the worn carpet. The air was heavy with the coppery tang of blood, and the silence in the house had become absolute, so unnatural that even the distant rumble of a passing carriage felt intrusive. "Holmes?" I called out softly, not daring to raise my voice. There was no reply. I knelt by the lifeless figure, pressing 2 fingers gently to his throat, though the effort was a futile one. The man was stone cold, his body slack. Judging by the stiffness in his jaw, he had not been dead more than 20 minutes. He was perhaps in his late 50s, with fine gray hair and a narrow face, handsome, once but gaunt and lined now, as though he had known too many burdens in his final years. I dared not linger. There was still no sign of Holmes. I checked the corridor. Empty. I moved quickly through the other upstairs rooms, abandoned, silent, some draped in dusty sheets, but my friend was nowhere to be found. A sudden panic seized me. Had Holmes walked willingly into this trap only to become its next victim? No, I told myself, steadying my breath. He is not so easily caught. He must be here, somewhere at last. From the ground floor, I heard the faint creak of a door opening. I rushed back down the stairs, revolver still drawn, and there he was. Holmes emerged from the shadows of the back parlor, calm as you please, brushing cobwebs from his shoulder, and carrying what appeared to be a rusted tin box. "You're pale." "Watson," he said mildly, "you found our unfortunate host, then?" "I thought you, good Lord, Holmes. I thought you'd been attacked." "Nearly," he said, glancing upstairs. The man screamed at the precise moment I entered the rear hallway. I chose not to rush in, but to see what movements occurred in response to the noise. That's when I noticed someone slipping down the tradesman's staircase. There was someone else? Yes, I gave brief chase, but the figure vanished through the back alley. Judging by the lightness of foot, I suspect a woman left behind this. He held up the tin box. The lid was dented and discolored, but as Holmes opened it carefully, I saw that inside lay a strange collection. A torn photograph, a single black glove, and a brooch shaped like a crimson lily. "Curious," I said. "Is there any connection to the victim upstairs?" Holmes closed the box gently. "No doubt, but let us first see what we can learn from the body itself. Come." We returned to room 6, and I observed Holmes in his element. He examined the victim with the detached precision of a scientist inspecting a specimen. His long fingers brushed aside the smoking jacket to reveal the wound more clearly. "Deep, clean," he murmured, "likely made by a razor or fine blade. The angle is left to right. Our assailant was either left-handed or approached from behind and to the right. No defensive wounds. He was taken by surprise." "Any idea who he is?" I asked. Holmes rifled through the man's pockets. No wallet, no calling cards. A faded silk handkerchief embroidered with a bee, a pack of French cigarettes, a key, and, at last, a small folded paper, perhaps once part of a larger envelope. Holmes opened it, and we read together. "Meet me. It is time to atone. Crimson returns to Baker Street. A." Holmes stared at the note for a long time. Our man was lured here, as we were, by the same hand, do you think? Unlikely. The telegram was typewritten and formal. This is handwritten and emotional. Two voices, two intentions. You think the killer is not the one who summoned you? I suspect a third party summoned him, and that he came with the intent to face someone or something he feared. I sat back, troubled. But what is this Crimson Spectre? And what does it have to do with Baker Street? Holmes' expression became unreadable. A question I have asked myself many times today. He took a moment to examine the scrawl on the wall, the grotesque message written in blood. The killer had time to write, yet not to flee entirely unnoticed. They risked leaving a signature. Either they wished it seen, or could not resist doing so. Suddenly, Holmes turned toward the fireplace. There, nestled within the grate, were scraps of half-burned papers. He retrieved them with the fire tongs and set them on the floor. Parchment, he noted. Not ordinary paper. And look at this. He pointed to an embossed crest, just visible on one edge of a charred corner. It showed a raven perched on a scythe. That symbol, I said. I've seen it before. Isn't it tied to an old secret society? Something from the East End? Holmes nodded. The Scarlet Ecclesia. Dismantled 20 years ago, or so we thought. He folded the paper and slipped it into his pocket. We have enough for tonight, but this is far from finished. Come, Watson, we shall let Lestrade play his part now. It was close to 2 in the morning when Inspector Lestrade arrived at the scene with 2 constables in tow. He looked both tired and annoyed at being dragged into another case that bore the fingerprints of Holmes' meddling. Another body in a drawing room, another cryptic message, Lestrade grumbled, though his eyes widened as he read the words on the wall. The Crimson Spectre? What devilry is this now? We don't know yet, Holmes replied, but it involves more than just murder. I'd advise guarding the back alley our culprit escaped that way. There may be traces left behind. Lestrade bent to examine the corpse and frowned. You haven't identified him? No. No papers, no name. But I believe he came here expecting a reckoning of some kind. He brought no weapon, no companion, only fear. And you, Holmes? Lestrade narrowed his eyes. You were invited here too, I suppose? Yes, as were you, I imagine. In due course. Lestrade straightened. I've half a mind to detain you for interfering. Holmes turned sharply. Do so, and you will delay justice by weeks. The person behind this is not finished. They've declared something made a move in a game that began long ago. He walked to the doorway, cloak swirling. I intend to find out how far this specter reaches, and whether it truly belongs in the past. We returned to Baker Street before dawn. Holmes was silent for most of the walk. At last, as we reached our door, he paused at the threshold and looked back across the street. The lodgings of a dead man, he murmured, and yet they were empty just yesterday. I followed his gaze. The upper window, room 6, was now in darkness, but in the streetlight's reflection, faint and fleeting, I saw what I could only describe as a silhouette watching us from behind the glass. A flash, and then it vanished. Holmes said nothing, but his face grew grim. Section Chapter 3. The Case of the Burned Brooch. The morning after the incident at the lodging house was thick with fog, heavier even than the evening prior, clinging to the city like a shroud drawn by invisible hands. Baker Street felt strangely subdued quiet, still as if even the cobblestones beneath our windows understood the gravity of what had transpired. I found myself watching the empty house across the street, more often than I cared to admit, half expecting some spectral face to press itself against the glass dot in our sitting room. The hearth burned steadily, and Holmes sat by it entirely motionless, save for the slow rise and fall of pipe smoke around his face. He had spoken little since dawn and had hardly touched the tea Mrs. Hudson brought up, though his keen eyes had scanned the contents of the tin box again and again, like a priest consulting sacred relics. I finally broke the silence. "Holmes, you have barely said a word since we returned. The brooch, the note, the signature and blood, it's all so deliberately theatrical. But what does it mean?" Holmes remained silent for a beat, then tapped the bowl of his pipe against the edge of the mantel. "It means," he said at last, "that this is not merely a murder, but a resurrection." I blinked. A resurrection of an old terror, a legend that has long since faded into whisper, something or someone called the Crimson Spectre, and this is not their first appearance. Holmes rose and crossed to his desk, where a battered leather folio lay open. He rifled through its contents, an odd assembly of clippings, correspondences, and reports, until he withdrew a yellowed article from the Westminster Gazette, dated October 1886. I leaned in to read the headline: "Shadow at St. Clement's. Aristocrat vanishes after ball." Holmes tapped the column. "Lord Hollingford disappeared without a trace from a charity event in Kensington. No ransom, no body. The only clue left behind was a red lily brooch, melted at the edges as if exposed to flame." I frowned. "That matches the one in the tin." "Precisely," Holmes said. "And the connection does not end there." He reached into the folio again and drew out a letter addressed to him in a fine, curling script. "Mr. Holmes, I believe my brother was taken by the same hand that once reached for Hollingford. I am told you are a man of reason, but reason has not stopped the spectre before. If you value justice, seek the house with the crimson curtains on Parchment Lane. You will find the key in the music." A friend of the lost, I looked up from the letter. "Who wrote this?" "I do not know," Holmes admitted. "It was delivered anonymously 2 years ago. The handwriting is not the same as that of last night's note, but the tone is similarly urgent. I filed it away as the work of a crank, but now ... He retrieved the crimson lily brooch from the tin. Upon closer inspection, I saw that its edges were indeed warped, as though it had been exposed to intense heat. The pin on the back was snapped, and the petals were scorched black. "There's a pattern," Holmes said. "The lily, the signature in blood, the dramatic warning, and more importantly, the utter lack of past for the victim." "Yes," I said, "we still don't know who he is." "Lestrade sent word this morning," Holmes replied, gesturing to a telegram on the sideboard. "The man's fingerprints were run against criminal archives. No match. His dental work is continental Austrian, perhaps. No banknotes, no ledger, no traceable belongings, invisible or erased," Holmes said gravely, "like a man who had reason to vanish from history." At that moment a knock came at the door, firm and brisk. Mrs. Hudson's voice preceded the visitor. "A lady to see you, Mr. Holmes." Very insistent. Holmes arched a brow, then gestured for her to be shown in. The woman who entered was tall, pale and statuesque, dressed in mourning gray with a netted veil over her face. She removed it with trembling hands to reveal striking blue eyes, sharp cheekbones, and an expression caught somewhere between defiance and dread. "My name is Lady Vire," she said, her voice clear and clipped. "I believe you are investigating a murder." Holmes motioned for her to sit. "We are. Do you believe you have information of relevance?" "I believe," she said, "that the man you found dead last night, ... was once my husband." I blinked. "Once your husband?" "Legally, yes," she replied, "but I have not seen him in over 7 years. I believed him dead. Now I read in the morning paper that an unknown man has been found across from your address with no identity, no papers. But they describe his build, his features, I am certain." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "You knew him as?" "Baron Wilhelm von Strade," she said. "He came to England in 86 under another name, Bartholomew Alcroft. He was not who he appeared to be." Holmes exchanged a glance with me. "May I ask, Lady Vire, how he came to vanish?" "We lived in Mayfair for 4 years. He had no occupation, claimed to be a retired diplomat, but strange visitors came to our door at all hours. He would disappear for days, then return looking exhausted, frightened. One day he burned a chest of letters in the garden. I asked him why. He said, 'The spectre has returned,' and the next morning he was gone." Holmes steepled his fingers. "Did you ever discover more about his past?" "Only fragments," she said. "He had scars on his back whip marks, old and deep. A servant once let slip that he had been involved in something called the Ecclesia." "Scarlet." "Ecclesia," Holmes murmured. "Then it is all connected." Lady Vire's gaze snapped to him. "You know of it?" Holmes did not answer directly. Instead, he walked to the fireplace and stared into the embers. "I believe, Lady Vire, that your late husband was indeed the man found in room 6. And I believe he was not the first victim of this spectre." She rose suddenly, her eyes wet but burning. "Then stop it. Whatever this thing is, this person, it will not stop unless someone sees it for what it truly is." "And what?" Holmes asked softly. "Is it?" She hesitated, then, in a whisper, "A judge." Holmes blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "They called it that," she said. "The spectre was a judge of the unrepentant, of those who betrayed the old order, those who knew too much." She drew something from her handbag and placed it. Carefully on the table between us, a folded sheet of music. "From Wilhelm's study," she said. "He left it behind when he vanished. I never understood it, but something about it always struck me as wrong." Holmes unfolded the paper, examining the notes. There, nestled between the staves, was a handwritten scroll. "Where silence is loudest and harmony is blind, the key is in the 5th. Holmes studied it a long time, then nodded, double quotes. "Thank you, Lady Vire. You have done a great service." She rose and left without another word. When the door had closed behind her, I turned to Holmes. "What does it mean?" He did not answer at first, then. "It means we go to Parchment Lane." Chapter 4. A crimson thread in the dark, the following morning found London enveloped in a peculiar, stagnant fog that clung low to the cobbled streets and smeared the outlines of even the closest buildings. At Baker Street, Holmes stood at the window, pipe clenched between his teeth, his silhouette dark against the muted light. He had scarcely spoken a word since our visit to Professor Redmayne, and though his eyes betrayed the rapid turning of thoughts, his manner had settled into an eerie stillness. I busied myself with the morning papers, the Times, Daily Chronicle, and Pall Mall Gazette, which Holmes had requested I gather. Each was opened and spread across the breakfast table, their ink still sharp from the press. Yet, to my surprise, none bore mention of the mutilated constable from Chain Walk or any disturbance in Chelsea. Curious, I remarked aloud, setting aside the final sheet. Not a single paper mentions last night's crime. Surely a mutilation in the shadow of the Thames would merit attention. Holmes turned slowly from the window. Not curious, suppressed. Suppressed? By whom? By someone with the requisite influence and interest. Lestrade is tight-lipped. No doubt he's been warned off. This is not a matter Scotland Yard is handling with its usual transparency. I frowned. But to what end? To prevent panic? Or to cover something larger? Precisely what I intend to discover, Holmes replied. But first we must understand the pattern. He paced back to the table and tapped the pile of newspapers. Tell me, Watson, what connects the ghostly visitation in Chain Walk to the disappearance of the violinist? And how does Professor Redmayne, a scholar of ancient mythology, feature in this macabre puzzle? I hesitated. They seemed at first glance disparate. But there is that color crimson, the cape on the spectre, the thread in the violinist's rune, and even the swath of curtain cloth Redmayne showed us dyed the same deep hue. Holmes gave a sharp nod. A symbol, a calling card, a signature, if you will. Just then, a rap came at the door, a brisk, agitated knock that echoed through the sitting room. Holmes raised an eyebrow. That, I believe, will be Miss Lillian Hargrave. I looked at him, surprised. You were expecting her? I left a note at Professor Redmayne's doorstep last night. Her reaction at the mention of the violinist was not that of a casual acquaintance. I imagine the connection between the two is stronger than Redmayne let on. Mrs. Hudson admitted the young woman moments later. Her cheeks were flushed with anxiety, and she clutched her gloves tightly in one hand as she stepped into the room. Mr. Holmes, she began, her voice tremulous, I'm sorry to arrive unannounced, but I saw your note, and I believe I must speak with you. Holmes gestured gently to the chair opposite him. Miss Hargrave, I assure you, your arrival is timely. May I introduce my friend and associate, Dr. John Watson? She gave a faint nod, then sat, still stiff with nervous energy. You knew the missing violinist, Holmes began. She hesitated. Yes, not well, but he gave me lessons for a short while. I'm a music student at the Royal Academy. But that is not the only connection, Holmes said gently. Her eyes flickered, and the tension in her shoulders tightened. Please, Miss Hargrave, I do not ask from idle curiosity. A man is missing. Another may be dead. You saw your uncle's reaction. When his name was mentioned, he is keeping something from the world, and I dare say from you as well. She swallowed hard, then spoke with sudden, almost desperate honesty. Victor Morel, he was my fiancé, or we were to be until recently. I leaned forward, taken aback. Holmes only inclined his head, unsurprised. We met last year at a recital. He was brilliant, passionate, but secretive. He never spoke of his past. Then 6 weeks ago, he vanished without word or warning. I went to the police. They said it wasn't a crime for a man to disappear, especially one with few known ties. Uncle insisted he had warned me about Victor, said the man was unstable. But I knew something was wrong. And did your uncle know of your engagement? Not until after Victor had vanished. I hadn't intended to keep it secret, but I feared Uncle would disapprove. And he did strongly. Holmes folded his hands beneath his chin. And tell me, Miss Hargrave, did Victor ever speak of a Crimson Spectre? She stared at him, startled. Yes, once I asked him about an old scar on his arm, and he told me it was from a fire. Then he said, almost laughing, "You'd think the Crimson Spectre had marked me." I thought it a joke. He never explained what it meant. Holmes was silent for a long moment, eyes distant. Then he said, "And your uncle's research, did Victor have access to it?" I believe so. They spoke once. Victor showed interest in ancient symbols rituals. Even I thought it was merely artistic curiosity. Holmes stood. Thank you, Miss Hargrave. You've confirmed what I suspected. Your fiancé's disappearance is at the heart of this mystery. Whatever this Crimson Spectre is, it is not merely myth. It walks London streets, cloaked in blood red and shadows. But what does it want? She whispered. That, Miss Hargrave, Holmes said, his voice low and urgent, is what I intend to find out. As she departed, visibly shaken but grateful, Holmes turned to me, expression sharpened with determination. We are missing a piece, he said. This patterned crimson cloth, disappearing artists, ancient rites, it speaks to something older than mere criminal enterprise. Tonight we visit the Chelsea embankment once more. I wish to see the place where the constable met his end. There is something there the yard did not see. You think the spectre will return? I asked, only half in jest. Holmes gave a grim smile. Perhaps. Or perhaps we shall find that even phantoms leave footprints. That evening, the fog thickened into a damp curtain that muffled the gaslight glow of the lampposts along Chain. We walked with purpose, Holmes striding slightly ahead, his coat drawn tight, his eyes scanning the shadows like a hound on a scent. The alley behind the artist's lodgings where the constable had been found was now cordoned off. But Holmes slipped through the barrier with the quiet grace of a cat. I followed, heart thudding in the silence. He crouched near the cobblestones, examining the blood-darkened brick. Then, pulling a lantern from his coat, he illuminated the wall behind the scene. "What do you see, Watson?" he asked. "A stain. Old soot. No graffiti." Wait, is that? Holmes raised the lantern higher. There, scratched faintly into the soot-blackened brick, was a symbol, a circle, with a vertical line running through its center, flanked by smaller glyphs resembling ancient runes. "Not soot," Holmes murmured. "Ash ritualistic, a mark left by fire and intention." "What is it? A warning, or a summoning? Perhaps both." He straightened slowly, eyes glittering. "We are not dealing with a murderer alone, Watson. We are contending with something theatrical, symbolic, a mind that believes itself enacting a story or a prophecy." As the distant chime of midnight echoed across the embankment, the fog stirred, and from deeper within the alley came a faint rustle. Holmes extinguished the lantern. "We are not alone," he whispered. Chapter 5. The Tale of the Silver Cufflink. Rain had ceased by morning, but a spectral dampness still clung to the air, like a fog of dread, curling beneath the soles of our shoes as Holmes and I walked briskly toward Covent Garden. A gray veil hung low across the city, and London's omnipresent chimney smoke lent the skyline its customary gloom. The events of the previous night still echoed through my mind. Mr. Alistair Fenwick's panic-stricken confession of the Crimson Spectre that had haunted him, and the grisly discovery of his wife, Lady Fenwick, pale and lifeless, her skin baring. The unnatural blotch of strangulation without bruising. I must confess, Holmes, I said, adjusting my coat collar as we navigated the slippery pavement, I have rarely felt so unsettled. The look in that man's eyes, he truly believes. He is being haunted. Holmes offered no immediate response. He was chewing slowly on a morsel of Turkish delight, having abandoned his pipe for the moment, and his brow furrowed in contemplation. "We are not yet in possession of the full truth, Watson," he finally replied. "And you know well how dangerous a half-truth can be. It is not the apparition which concerns me, but rather the quiet details surrounding it." He pulled from his pocket a small envelope, creased and faintly perfumed. "You recall the letter that brought Lady Fenwick to my doorstep. There's something rather odd about it. I remember it clearly. No name, no address, merely a date, an hour." "Precisely," Holmes said. "An invitation absent of origin. I examined it again this morning. The ink used was not of the common variety, but a particular violet shade often used in French boudoirs and private salons. And the paper manufactured exclusively by Durand Frères of Calais. Whoever sent that letter was either French or wanted us to believe they were." As we reached the iron gates of the Fenwick residence, a tall man in a bowler hat stepped out from beneath the eaves of a neighboring house and hailed us. "Inspector Lestrade," I exclaimed in recognition. "Dr. Watson, Mr. Holmes." Lestrade greeted us with a grim nod. "You'll want to come in. There have been developments." Holmes gestured for him to proceed, and we followed the inspector through the ornate entryway into the drawing room. The house had lost its warmth. It felt hollow, as though drained of life. Mr. Fenwick sat hunched on a leather settee, eyes bloodshot, with a glass of port trembling in his fingers. Across from him stood a severe-looking woman in her late 50s, dressed in mourning black, with iron-gray hair pulled tightly into a chignon. "Lady Rowena Strathmore," Lestrade said quietly to us. "Sister to the late Lady Fenwick." She acknowledged our arrival with a mere lift of her chin. "I trust you will conduct your inquiries with discretion, Mr. Holmes," she said coldly. "My sister's reputation must not be muddied in the press." Holmes gave a slight bow. "I understand, and I assure you that discretion is as valuable to me as to you. But truth, madam, is more valuable still." Lestrade cleared his throat and took a small folded handkerchief from his pocket. He opened it to reveal a silver cufflink, simple yet elegant, inlaid with a tiny opal. "This was found," he said, "beneath the folds of the sitting-room rug. It matches none of Mr. Fenwick's formal wear, and the staff all deny ownership." Holmes took the cufflink delicately, inspecting the minute creases of the metal. "French make again," he murmured. "And this design, Watson, you'll recall seeing something similar in that Parisian tailor's on Rue de Rivoli 2 years ago, during the affair of the Russian violinist." "You mean Fabien Moreau?" I asked. Holmes nodded slowly. Indeed. And he, as I recall, was not only fond of opals, but also had a habit of embroidering small symbols. Yes, here see the letter M etched beneath the clasp. Lestrade squinted at the engraving. You think it belongs to Moreau? I think. Inspector, Holmes said, rising to his feet, that someone has taken great pains to drag the past into the present. Tell me, Lady Strathmore, did your sister have any recent correspondence with anyone from her days on the continent? Rowena's expression remained unchanged, but her fingers twitched slightly. Not to my knowledge, she said. Eleanor was not well lately. Her mind wandered. Ah, yes. The phantom, Holmes said dryly. The Crimson Spectre of Baker Street. A hallucination? Or so you believe? I believe no such thing, Lady Strathmore snapped, color rising in her cheeks. She wrote to me of it in trembling fear. Said it appeared to her near the fire where your Mr. Holmes once sat, and again upon the staircase, always with glowing eyes as if lit from within. Holmes remained impassive. And what of your sister's past? Any enemies, suitors, or scandals? Rowena hesitated, then exhaled. She was courted by a certain gentleman in Paris, a poet, Fabien Moreau, I believe, but he was unstable. She ended it. Yet he did not, Holmes said softly. And now a piece of his clothing has materialized near the site of her death. She would never have let him near this house, Rowena said indignantly. Then someone else did. Holmes turned suddenly to Fenwick, who had remained silent. Mr. Fenwick, you said last night you saw the spectre standing by the piano. Do you recall whether it carried anything, an object, a light? I can't say, he stammered. I saw only the red glow in its eyes. It didn't speak, but the smell. There was a strange scent, powdery, like violets. Violets. Holmes repeated. The ink, the perfume, the link returns. We moved then to Lady Fenwick's private study, a room lightly adorned with Parisian art, and a faint hint of the same floral perfume. Holmes examined her writing desk, opening drawers and flipping through personal letters, pausing only when he came across an envelope sealed in red wax with an unfamiliar crest, a cost falcon perched upon a rose. He studied it with care before breaking. The sealed dot inside was a single sheet of ivory parchment, with a short verse handwritten in French. The crimson veil will fall once more, your sins to shadow, your lies to score. Beware the hour the bells do chime, when debts return to claim their time. Watson felt a shiver down his spine. That sounds more like a threat than poetry. Indeed, Holmes said, folding the letter, and not the work of a madman, but of a performer, a man of theatricality and vengeance. He turned to Lestrade. We must find Moreau, alive or dead. But we don't even know if he's in England, Lestrade objected. Holmes smiled faintly. Then we shall make England call to him. As we exited the study, the hallway echoed with the sound of soft footsteps. Holmes paused. A maid stood nearby, her head bowed. Sir, she said nervously, there's something you should see. In the cellar? Lestrade frowned. What in the devil would be in the cellar? Holmes didn't reply. He merely motioned us forward. Down the creaking wooden stairs we descended, past cobwebs and rusted wine racks, until we reached the cold stone floor below. The maid pointed to a narrow storage alcove. There, she whispered. It was locked yesterday, but now ... Holmes stepped forward and opened the alcove door. Inside, amidst boxes of linen and crates of wine, lay a long velvet cloak the color of blood. Holmes touched the fabric. It shimmered faintly, unnaturally, and from beneath its folds, a second cufflink gleamed. Chapter 6. A letter in scarlet ink. The rain had ceased by morning, leaving behind a dripping silence over Baker Street. Fog clung low to the cobbles, lending the street its customary pallor, as if reluctant to release its hold on the mysteries of the night. Holmes stood by the fireplace, still in his dressing gown, the remnants of a Turkish cigarette curling languidly. From his fingers, he stared into the flames with the intensity of a man watching the unfolding of some private drama. I had just returned from an errand to the chemist's, and found the morning edition of the Times already folded upon the table, with 2 articles neatly marked in pencil, an unmistakable sign that Holmes had already begun his analysis. Yet he had spoken little since the return from Lambeth, and this strange encounter with Miss Clara. Pelling's old journal seemed to weigh heavily on his thoughts. Still no word from Inspector Lestrade? I asked, attempting to provoke conversation. None, though I expect he shall appear before noon. He is not a man to ignore a corpse discovered in so public a fashion, particularly one so peculiar. You believe the death of that man by the river bank is connected to the woman in Baker Street? I asked. Holmes gave a brief smile, as if at some inward amusement. Come, Watson, you know me better than to ask such a question. Everything is connected. It is merely a question of how tightly or loosely the threads are woven. I took my chair and leaned forward. You suspect more than one death, don't you? Holmes took a final draw from his cigarette and crushed it into the ashtray. I suspect, my dear Watson, that we are only glimpsing the surface of a far deeper pool. The crimson writing on the wall, the unnatural stillness of Miss Pelling, the symbolic nature of the artifacts left in that room, these are not the hallmarks of a deranged mind acting in impulse. They are ... performative. He turned suddenly. Do you recall the case of Lord Wetherby's final performance? You mean the actor who feigned his death in order to expose a blackmailer? Precisely. Except here, the audience is not merely one man. It is us, or rather me. You believe this killer is staging these murders as a message to you? Not just a message, he murmured. A performance. And the intended audience is not only me, but the city at large. There's a theatricality in this crimson motif, something deliberately poetic in the way the killer scripts their scenes. The journal we found last night may offer a clue. He reached for the small black volume retrieved from Clara Pelling's attic and opened it to the page where a red ribbon had been inserted. She writes, in 1879, he watches me through the mirror. I fear what he sees. He whispers in verse, always in verse. Crimson dreams follow me. A chill crept through the room, despite the fire. I recalled the photograph in the attic, the girl's haunted eyes staring off frame. You think these writings are real, not madness? Ah, Watson, he said. Softly, madness itself can be a method. That journal is not merely the expression of a broken mind. It may be a record of something more tangible, an obsession passed from one mind to another, like a contagion. Just then, Mrs. Hudson's knock echoed from the hallway. Before Holmes could speak, she appeared, holding an envelope with a gloved hand. This came for you, Mr. Holmes. No return address. And ... It smells like roses, Holmes took the envelope, turning it over. The paper was thick, old-fashioned, sealed in scarlet wax and printed with a stylized V. He slit it carefully, and as he drew out the folded note, a faint trace of perfume wafted through the air sickly, sweet and oddly familiar. "What is it?" I asked. Holmes did not answer immediately. His eyes scanned the page, then narrowed. He handed it to me. The message was written in a careful, calligraphic script, crimson ink on pale parchment. "The stage is set, and Act 1 is complete." Clara spoke her final line beneath the gaslight's gaze. "But another voice is rehearsing now, rehearsing with blades and dreams. You see patterns, Mr. Holmes, but do you hear the rhyme? Follow the silence between the notes. V. There was silence in the room, broken only by the faint ticking of the mantel clock. "A theatrical madman," I said finally. "A lunatic with delusions of poetry and murder." "Possibly," Holmes said. "But look at the signature. The letter V? Indeed. And do you recall what Lestrade said about the river victim? That there were strange markings on the man's back, carved into the skin. A perfect V between the shoulder blades. This is not the first time the letter has appeared." Holmes turned and pulled his files from the desk. He rifled through them, then retrieved a weathered article from the Evening Standard, dated some 5 months prior. "Read this," he instructed. It was a short piece reporting on the death of an archivist at the British Museum, found in the manuscript room after hours. Cause of death was listed as extensive blood loss from self-inflicted wounds, though the coroner expressed puzzlement at the unnatural precision of the injuries. One passage had been underlined by Holmes. Double quotes ... A strange symbol was etched into the subject's chest resembling the letter V, drawn in what police believe may have been his own blood. "You think that man is connected to this killer?" I asked. "I think," Holmes said gravely, "that these are not isolated incidents. They are rehearsals." A knock at the front door interrupted us. Moments later, Lestrade entered, removing his hat and gloves with a weariness that bespoke little sleep. "Well, gentlemen," he said, "I dare say I've had more agreeable mornings. Your friend by the Thames, name's Lionel Wicks, former actor, lived above a music hall in Southwark." Holmes' eyes flickered. "An actor, you say? Retired? Or rather retired by drink and misfortune. Seems he hadn't worked in years. Neighbors said he kept muttering about a ghost in the Red Mirror. Whatever that means." Holmes stepped forward. "Lestrade, I require access to his residence." Immediately, Lestrade raised a brow. "Already cordoned off? But I can escort you there." Holmes turned to me, eyes bright with a manic intensity. "Watson, fetch your coat. The curtain is rising again." As we stepped out into the fog, I could not help but feel the strange weight of the unseen. There was something chilling in Holmes' certainty, as if he were reading from a script only he could decipher. And somewhere, just beyond the veil of mist, the Crimson Spectre waited. Chapter 7. The whisper from the crypt the following morning broke with a thick veil of mist over London, the streets outside Baker Street shimmering with a cold dampness that clung to the cobblestones. Dr. Watson was seated near the fire with my notes scattered before me, attempting to make sense of the disparate elements that Holmes had allowed me to glimpse. The mysterious silhouette from the alley, the absence of any signs of forced entry at Lady Adeline's home, and the cryptic markings on the envelope. It all swirled in my mind like smoke from the hearth. Holmes emerged from his room at precisely 7 minutes past 8, his dressing gown hanging open and his hair still tousled. In one hand he carried a small velvet pouch, and in the other a crisp note. "You slept poorly, Watson," he remarked, glancing at me only momentarily as he crossed to the table. "The clinking of your pen betrayed you until nearly 3. I managed. A tired smile. I cannot help but be haunted by the figure you described. You truly believe this Crimson Spectre is a living person and not some trick of light or legend? Ghosts seldom leave footprints or cast shadows in gaslight, my dear Watson," Holmes said with a flick of his hand. "Now we must turn our attention to the source of that note." He dropped the paper before me. It was written in an elegant but hurried hand. "Mr. Holmes, if you value the safety of Lady Adeline Hargrave, I implore you to visit the family crypt at Kensal Green before midnight tonight. Come alone, no police." A friend in mourning, I looked up from the note. Another meeting under cover of darkness? Holmes' expression was unreadable, but the spark in his eyes revealed a certain relish. "Yes, and this time I suspect the spectre may be more than a theatrical shadow." By the time we arrived at Kensal Green Cemetery that evening, the thick London fog had transformed the landscape into a realm of ghostly silhouettes and oppressive silence. Grave markers loomed like sentinels, and trees gnarled and bent stood, motionless as though eavesdropping. Holmes led the way through the gate, a lantern in one hand and his walking stick in the other. He was uncharacteristically quiet, his usual monologues replaced with a grim attentiveness to every sound around us. "I've often remarked," I whispered as we passed a row of moss-covered tombs, "that these late-night excursions never end with a cup of tea and cheerful company." Holmes smirked, but offered no reply. The Hargrave family crypt stood at the far end of the cemetery, a grand structure with aged stone lions guarding the entrance. The iron gates were slightly ajar, swaying faintly in the wind. Holmes motioned for silence and pushed the gate open. It gave a soft groan, the kind that would echo in a man's bones. We stepped inside. The air was heavy with mildew and age. Shelves lined with sealed stone coffins lined the walls. The Hargrave family had apparently been prominent for generations. Holmes raised the lantern and then stopped abruptly. On the floor, directly in front of the central sarcophagus, was a single red glove. Next to it a rose, its petals blackened at the tips as if touched by fire. On the wall behind the tomb, someone had etched a message into the stone with deliberate slashes. "She shall join them soon." Watson swallowed. "Good God, Holmes." Holmes crouched by the glove and sniffed the rose. "Sulphur," he murmured. "Curious. Someone wanted to invoke brimstone." "A theatrical touch?" I offered, trying to suppress his shiver. "More than that. This was meant to unsettle, not just Lady Adeline, but me as well." The note was a lure. I looked around, heart pounding. "Do you think we're being watched?" Holmes nodded almost imperceptibly. "Undoubtedly. But whoever our crimson-cloaked spectre may be, they've chosen to vanish once more into the fog." Back at Baker Street an hour later, Holmes laid out the glove, the rose, and a torn scrap of silk we'd found caught on a corner of the gate. "It's from the same fabric as the cloak Lady Adeline described," he said. "Italian velvet, particular dye once used in Venetian masquerade garments. Expensive, rare. So we're dealing with someone of wealth, or someone posing as such." Holmes lit his pipe, and the inscription on the crypt clearly intended as a warning. "But to whom?" "To Lady Adeline, surely," I replied. The message was clear. "Not quite, Watson. There's a second interpretation. What if it wasn't a threat, but a declaration of intent to someone else? A confidant, an accomplice, someone emotionally bound to the woman or to the Hargrave lineage?" I frowned. "Then the specter could be personal to her, or personal to the family history," Holmes sighed quietly. "Which brings us to an old curiosity. Did you notice the name beside Lady Adeline's mother's tomb?" I thought back to the crypt. Marguerite Hargrave. Indeed. But Marguerite Hargrave did not die of natural causes. She was the subject of a quiet scandal, whispers of madness and exile. She died in seclusion, far from the family estate, and yet she was buried in the family crypt, which suggests someone defied the Hargrave patriarch's orders. "You believe this connects to the present threat?" "I believe," Holmes said, tapping ash into the fireplace, "that the sins of the past have found new breath." The following morning, as Holmes pored over legal registries and birth records in his armchair, a visitor was announced. Mrs. Hudson entered with a card on a silver tray. Holmes took it and arched an eyebrow. "Father, Caleb Greaves, vicar of St. Ignatius in the Mire. Curious. Show him in." The vicar who entered was a gaunt, ascetic man with pale eyes and trembling hands. He wore a heavy cross around his neck and looked as though he had not slept in days. "I beg your pardon for intruding upon your morning, Mr. Holmes," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "But I come with a matter most grave." "You're quite timely, Father," Holmes replied. "Please, sit. What troubles you?" The vicar hesitated. "It is regarding the Hargrave family. I once served as their confessor many years ago, and last night someone broke into the vestry of my church. They left only a single item behind." He opened a leather satchel and produced a delicate brooch set with garnets in the shape of a weeping eye. Watson leaned in. "That symbol." "Again," Father Greaves nodded. "It belonged to Marguerite Hargrave. I last saw it on the day of her burial." Holmes stood abruptly, eyes lit with energy. "Then the past is not simply whispering, it is crying out, Father Greaves, and someone has been listening." Chapter 8. A visit to Milligan House. The rain had ceased by morning, leaving London wrapped in a gray veil of dampness and soot. Fog crawled low over the cobbles, licking the boots of early risers and vanishing into alleyways like ghosts of the night. Holmes stood by our parlor window, unmoving, pipe in hand, his gaze fixed on the pale daylight struggling through the mist. "Watson," he said at last, "have you noticed a curious thing about the timing of the attacks?" I looked up from my seat near the fire. "Besides their proximity and location?" "Indeed. They seem to follow an irregular pattern first. A gap of 2 weeks, then 3 days, then another fortnight. But I believe the timing is not random." Before I could respond, Mrs. Hudson brought in the Morning Post. Holmes snatched a thick envelope from the top with a glint in his eye. The paper bore a wax seal, a faint impression of a wolf's head, and the address was written in a neat, practiced hand. A reply from Inspector Bradstreet. Holmes broke the seal and scanned the note. My dear Holmes, as per your inquiry, I investigated the premises at 17 Milligan House, once the property of Algernon Thwaite, deceased 6 months ago. His widow, Mrs. Celestin Thwaite, still resides there. No record of criminal activity was found in connection with the property, but a curious pattern of disturbances has been reported by nearby tenants' shadows seen in upper windows. Strange. Keening sounds after midnight, and one constable claimed to see a cloaked figure retreating into the courtyard last Tuesday. You may find the location worth a visit. Yours, Bradstreet. Holmes folded the letter with care. To Milligan House, Watson. Milligan. House stood on the edge of Gray's Inn Road, its once grand facade now weathered by neglect. The ornate ironwork gate creaked as we passed through, and the overgrown garden gave the place the feel of a forgotten mausoleum. Mrs. Thwaite received us in a dim sitting room where heavy curtains shut out most of the daylight. She was a woman of 50 or so, with a stiff bearing and eyes that betrayed little emotion. I understand, she said, that you are investigating the recent ... madness. Incidents, madam, Holmes corrected gently. Would you say your home has experienced any unusual occurrences in recent months? She looked past us to the fireplace where a dying fire hissed. It began after my husband's passing. He left many debts, and though I sold most of our assets, I chose to remain here. There were noises scratching in the walls, whimpering in the attic. I thought it rats. But then the servants began leaving. Holmes sat forward. Describe the sounds, please. She hesitated, then said, moaning, at times. A dragging sound in the hallway on certain nights. I thought I dreamed it, but once I found my armchair moved from its place when I awoke. I live alone now. Holmes stood, pacing slowly toward the wall and placing his palm flat against the floral wallpaper. Do you ever entertain visitors? No, I've become something of a recluse. Holmes turned. Have you, by any chance, noticed a peculiar set burnt sulfur, for instance, or found any marks drawn or carved within your home? She stiffened. Yes, she said after a moment. Something drawn on the inside of my wardrobe door. A red circle with a line through it. I scrubbed it off. Holmes glanced at me, eyes gleaming. May we examine the upper rooms? Mrs. Thwaite consented, and we were soon ascending the narrow staircase. The top corridor was thick with dust, the air colder than below. Holmes moved swiftly, peering into one room after another. Finally, in the third guest room, he stopped. Watson, he called. Observe. A circle was etched into the floorboards near the window, faint but precise. Within it were strange symbols, some vaguely Eastern, others I did not recognize. Holmes crouched, studying it. We are not merely dealing with theatrics. This is ritualistic, intended to inspire dread or perhaps summon belief in the spectral. But I suspect it serves a more practical purpose. From his coat he drew a small magnifying lens and examined the window frame. Ah, here. He showed me a nearly invisible wire strung through the frame's edge. It led to a metal trigger tucked beneath the windowsill. Watson, he said quietly, this room is the source of the supposed spectre. The light is manipulated, sounds amplified or carried from another room. Someone wants the residents to believe this house is haunted. And to what end? Holmes rose. That is the riddle. But I believe Mrs. Thwaite is being observed and perhaps manipulated for a purpose yet unrevealed. As we descended the stairs, Holmes paused beside a framed photograph on the landing. It depicted a young man in military uniform standing beside Mrs. Thwaite and her late husband. "Your son?" Holmes asked when we returned to the parlor. "Henry," she said softly. "He was lost at El Teb in '84. We have not spoken of him in years." "Forgive my intrusion," Holmes said gently, "but you may wish to reconsider the company you keep or the company that keeps you." "We shall return again, madam." Back at Baker Street, Holmes wasted no time in transcribing a telegram. To Scotland Yard, please locate and interview all former tenants of Milligan House, particularly those who vacated in last 6 months. Focus. Reasons for departure, sightings, noises, unpaid debts. Urgent. HEC sealed the message and rang for the boy. Turning to me, he said, "There is a pattern here. Watson tenants fleeing in fear, strange rituals, and now 3 attacks, all within a square mile of this house." I nodded. "You think the Crimson Spectre is no spirit, but a man using fear as a weapon?" "Precisely. And somewhere in that house lies the link between the apparitions and the bloodletting in the alleyways. But why now? And why Mrs. Thwaite?" Holmes' eyes narrowed. "Because, my dear Watson, whoever our adversary is, they are not yet finished." Chapter 9. Through the veil of crimson. The fog had grown heavier that evening, curling in silent eddies around the gas lamps of Baker Street, as though London itself were holding its breath. Holmes sat cross-legged upon the hearthrug, a curious figure with a violin balanced upon his knee, and his gaze fixed intently on the dancing flames. I had long since put aside my journal, and instead observed him, my mind teeming with unanswered questions. He had been thus for nearly an hour utterly still, save for the occasional pluck of a string or muttered phrase. A pipe lay forgotten upon the mantel, the tobacco within it long gone cold. The room was heavy with thought, yet not a word had passed between us since we'd returned from our unsuccessful attempt to find Miss Eliza Harrow's supposed watcher near the Mortlake graveyard. Finally Holmes stirred, setting aside the violin with a soft sigh. "Watson," he said, "we have been dancing at the edges of the truth like moths circling a lamp, and I fear we shall be consumed by the flame unless we begin to approach it from a different angle." "You believe we are being misled?" I asked. "A deliberate deception?" He gave a half-smile. "What better way to hide a truth than in plain sight, if the thing that appears spectral is in fact calculated? This case, Watson, bears the peculiar scent of stagecraft, something theatrical, but not for amusement, rather to provoke fear." "Then you believe the Crimson Spectre is no phantom at all?" Holmes stood and moved to the cluttered side table, where he had collected the various scraps and mementos from the case thus far. Eliza's letter, a broken cufflink from the crypt floor, the flyer advertising Delacroix's Phantasms and Apparitions theatrical exhibition from 3 years prior, and most recently a monogrammed silk ribbon discovered entangled in the latches of the crypt door. "This ribbon," he said, holding it to the gaslight, "is far from ordinary French silk. Custom embroidery. The thread itself bears the insignia of a Parisian atelier, known only to cater to performers of the Grand Guignol tradition." I blinked. Surely not the Macabre Theatre? Indeed. And what's more curious is this Delacroix, though discredited, After his seance scandal in '89, vanished from public life without ever disclosing his final tour. Rumors abound that he died in poverty. But what if, Watson, he did not vanish at all, but merely changed venues? Holmes paused, and in that familiar glint in his eye, I sensed that we were nearing the heart of the mystery. You believe Delacroix himself is behind the hauntings? I asked. Not necessarily, but his methods, illusion, manipulation, psychological conditioning are at play. We are not merely facing a criminal, Watson. We are contending with an illusionist. At that moment Mrs. Hudson appeared, her face uncommonly pale. "Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice trembling. "A man is here. Refuses to give his name, but says you must see him immediately. He's in a dreadful state." Holmes nodded curtly. "Send him in." A moment later the door creaked open, revealing a gaunt, shivering figure swathed in a greatcoat. The man stumbled forward, his eyes hollow and fixed upon Holmes. "I beg of you," he rasped. "Help me. The spectre has followed me from the dead." "Sit, sir," Holmes said with surprising gentleness. "You are safe here. Now who are you, and what do you mean?" The man collapsed into the armchair, and after gulping down a brandy, Mrs. Hudson pressed into his hand, began to speak. His name, he revealed, was Theodore Renshaw, a once prominent illusionist and contemporary of Delacroix. The years had not been kind. His face was lined with wear and alcohol, and his fingers trembled with each gesture. "I saw it, he whispered, "in the graveyard. It wasn't a ghost, it was him, Delacroix, or something made to look like him. Crimson cloak, white mask, just like in the old days. But he's dead. He died in Prague." Holmes' fingers steepled. "Did you see the face?" "No, masked, but the way he moved, the gesture he made with the cane, it was the same stage trick he used before his finale act." "You say the same, which means you were close to him." "We toured together once," Renshaw said, his voice cracking, "before he changed. Became obsessed with blurring the line between illusion and death. Claimed the dead could feel the audience watching. Said he was conducting a grand seance for the world, but it wasn't real, Holmes. It was never real. And yet you're terrified." "I found this," Renshaw said, producing a fragment of parchment from his coat pocket. "It was faded and stained, yet I could still make out the crimson ink and strange sigils drawn across it." Holmes inspected it silently, then nodded. "From one of Delacroix's spectral plays. A prop, but used deliberately here to unsettle you." He turned to me. "Watson, we must pay a visit to the one man who may yet know where the line between Delacroix's illusion and reality finally blurred. Archibald Penrose, theatrical historian and Delacroix's final collaborator." Renshaw grabbed Holmes' arm. "Don't go, Holmes. If you do, you won't return the same. He changes people." Holmes offered a tight smile. "I am not easily changed, Mr. Renshaw, and unlike ghosts, illusionists leave footprints." Later, that night, the Penrose residence, Kensington. The wind howled through the narrow streets of Kensington, rattling the windows of the elegant but time-worn home where Archibald Penrose resided. We were ushered in by a pale manservant who said not a word, his eyes darting behind us, as though expecting someone or something unseen. Penrose was waiting in his study, seated in a high-backed chair like a marionette that had been partially cut from its strings. His hands rested motionless upon a book of theatrical sketches. "Holmes," he rasped, barely glancing up. "I knew you would come." "You've heard of the recent spectral occurrences?" Holmes asked, settling across from him. "More than that," Penrose said. "I helped design them." A silence followed. Even I was momentarily stunned. "I should explain," Penrose continued. "Years ago, Delacroix and I worked together on a production entitled Les Vengeance Rouge, a story of a ghost who returns to enact revenge through staged hauntings. It was never meant to be performed. Too dangerous, too real. But he became consumed, believed it a new art form. Not theater, but terror as a medium." He looked up at us, his eyes watery and glassy with dread. "I burned my copy of the script, but he, Delacroix, preserved his. And now it is being acted out in life." Holmes' eyes narrowed. "By whom?" Penrose shook his head. "I do not know. But if the pattern holds, the next act is the Crimson Absolution. A public display, a reckoning. There will be blood spilled under gaslight." He leaned forward. "You must stop it, Mr. Holmes, because if you don't, London won't believe in ghosts, but they will believe in fear." Chapter 10. A cracked portrait and a name in ashes. The following morning arrived beneath a thick veil of mist. Baker Street lay hushed beneath a curtain of pale fog, and the clatter of hooves on cobblestones seemed subdued by the air's oppressive weight. Holmes, who had remained in his armchair through most of the night, stirred as I brought in the morning's post and a steaming pot of coffee. "You haven't slept," I observed, glancing at the barely touched blanket folded on the ottoman. "I have rested in mind, Watson, if not in body," Holmes replied, reaching for the coffee. "While you enjoyed the comforts of Morpheus, I engaged in correspondence with a fellow from the telegraph office at Paddington. Look here." He handed me a folded message. "It concerns one of our missing threads." I scanned the note quickly. It was a brief confirmation, a man fitting. Mr. Portmore's description had sent a telegram to a private residence in Hampstead on the day before his supposed suicide. The address had been traced to a Mrs. Agnes Delmer, unmarried, but formerly companion to Lady Wrexham, a name I recalled vaguely from Holmes's list of minor nobility. Holmes stood and began pacing. A man sends a telegram, then perishes. "Mysteriously," he said, "and it is not his only correspondence of that day. Lestrade has confirmed that a second letter was discovered in the ashes of the Portmore fireplace, half-burnt, its intended recipient obscured, save for a few legible words. If I do not arrive, trust no one, not even..." "Not even whom?" I asked. "That's the mystery. The rest was charred away, but the letter was written in haste and secrecy. We now have two women, Miss Clerbell Hartright, the mysterious music teacher, and this Agnes Delmer, both with ties to Portmore, and both, I believe, concealing truths of vastly different shades." A soft knock interrupted our conversation. Mrs. Hudson entered, her expression prim. "Inspector Lestrade, gentlemen. He's in the sitting room." Lestrade's arrival was seldom without urgency, and today was no different. He entered with his hat still in hand and a look of flinty purpose on his face. "I've brought something you'll want to see," he announced. "It was discovered at Portmore's Hampstead cottage during a quiet sweep last night." He placed a small parcel, wrapped in cloth, onto the table. Holmes unwrapped it gingerly. Inside lay a cracked oval portrait, miniature, its glass shattered across the face of a solemn-looking young woman with pale eyes and dark hair. The frame bore a single word etched on the back, Honora. Holmes narrowed his gaze. So the sister exists. Lestrade nodded. More than exists, Holmes. She was seen. A neighbor swears a woman matching this image visited the cottage a week ago and departed at night with a man in dark riding attire. That same night, someone reported screams from within the house, but no one came to investigate until days later. I leaned in. And no one's seen either of them since? Not a trace, but a traveling bag was found in a hedge near the river path, water stained, but still bearing the initials a D inside the lining. Holmes folded his arms and stared into the middle distance. The ghost of Honora Portmore walks again, he muttered. And I believe she's not just a ghost of the past, but the very keystone of this entire business. Lestrade cleared his throat. There's more. A curious pattern emerged from the burned remnants of Portmore's personal papers. A page recovered from his journal, well singed, but decipherable, spoke of a final reckoning, and something referred to only as the ravens accord. Ring any bells? Holmes's eyes flickered. No, but the metaphor is unmistakable, ominous, secretive, and no doubt tied to the clandestine history Portmore kept from the world. I believe it's time we call on Miss Hartright again. Her demeanor may be prim, but I suspect her knowledge is anything but innocent. We journeyed that afternoon back to the refined but shadowed interior of Miss Claribel Hartright's residence in Knightsbridge. She received us with less poise than before, her features drawn and her hands trembling slightly as she poured the tea. I heard about Mr. Portmore, she said before we could speak. They say it was suicide. I don't believe it. You are correct not to, Holmes said quietly. Miss Hartright, we've reason to believe Mr. Portmore feared for his life. His journal contains references to a reckoning and an ominous pact called the Raven's Accord. Does that name mean anything to you? She paused, one hand suspended mid-air with a teapot in hand. For a long moment, silence reigned. Then, I had hoped never to hear those words again. Watson and I exchanged a glance. Holmes waited. It was not a name spoken openly, she continued. But Mr. Portmore was involved in something years ago. A gathering of men, bound by a promise of secrecy. They were wealthy, well-placed, and frightened of something of someone. Portmore referred to it once, by accident. He was frightened, truly frightened, and he wasn't a man easily cowed. Do you know who else was part of this pact? Her face turned pale. He never gave names, but I believe there were 4. One of them was a titled man another from the banking world. He once mentioned a meeting at a chapel ruin somewhere in Sussex. It was after that meeting that he became different, guarded, haunted even. Holmes leaned forward. And Honora? His sister? Miss Hartright's eyes welled. She was never mad, you know. That was all convenient. She opposed them. She learned something they did not want known. I believe she vanished for her own safety. Or perhaps they made her vanish? Holmes stood suddenly, the fire in his eyes unmistakable. Then the answer lies not just in London, but in the past, in Sussex. Miss Hartright clutched the arm of her chair. If you go, be careful. The Raven's Accord did not tolerate betrayal. As we exited the house, the chill in the evening air settled in, with an almost sentient malevolence. "Well, Holmes," I said, wrapping my coat tighter. "Where to next?" "Next?" Holmes turned toward me. "We head to Raidhill. There is a chapel ruin outside the village abandoned since the war. I believe it holds the key to the ghosts that walk behind Portmore's death. And you believe this Honora still lives? If she does, Watson, she holds the match that will ignite the entire powder keg. But if she does not—" He paused, then stepped into the fog. "Then we chase shadows, and someone else plays the Raven's game in her name.